Shawn and Ben talked about Justyn Ross on Stealing Bananas this past week. It got a lot of attention on that conversation. But when we look at Justyn Ross now signed with the Kansas City Chiefs after going undrafted, we look at the Clemson wide receivers, what they did in 2018. So obviously we're going on a time machine back to 2018, but kind of Justyn Ross's last season pre-injury, 1,000 yards for him that season. That offense also had T. Higgins, who had 936 yards. We had Amari Rodgers, who is he is technically with the Packers. We'll see what happens in year 2, 575 yards. And then Hunter Renfrow, 544 yards. So we had Higgins, who went in the 2nd round. Rodgers went in the 3rd round. Renfrow went in the 5th round. They were all drafted, but Ross obviously wasn't. Had the injury issue, obviously the concerns around that. I don't think there's any way he goes undrafted without that. I'm going to put a projection on you. Where do you think he would have went without the injury, based on where what we've seen through his college production? And then now that he's signed with the Chiefs, the quote that you had put on Twitter was, "A smart organization is taking a worthwhile risk." I guess following up with that, will Ross make that final roster? And then what are your expectations if he does survive those final cut downs?
So the first question, where do I think he would have, where do I think he would have gone? And so let's kind of assume something close to full health, and assume that with that health, he is more dynamic in his pre-draft workouts, because his pro day wasn't great. And it's hard to know how much of that is because of his physical condition, but let's assume he's a little more athletic. I would say, I don't know, 3rd round. Like that, he feels like a 3rd rounder. If, he's got the college production, maybe still some of the injury history, but he's just healthier now. Will he make the team? Man, this makes me think of, this is going way back. There was a guy coming out of, it wasn't University of Tennessee. He had played at Tennessee. He left Tennessee and he played at another school in Tennessee, the name of which escapes me. But this guy's name was Derrick Rogers. And this was I don't know, 2013, something like that. And he seemed like he was a 5-star recruit. He was productive early on in Tennessee and productive again at the second school he went to. Tore up the combine, was like a big guy, super athletic, went totally undrafted. And I remember thinking okay, this guy has such a high ceiling, even though he went undrafted. All he has to do is make the team. And I was, routinely beating myself up thinking about, okay, I'm now in the 3rd round of this rookie draft. Do I take him or do I take this guy that was drafted in the 4th round? And my perspective now looking back on that is it doesn't matter. He's an undrafted wide receiver. It doesn't matter. And that's kind of the perspective I want to have. The nihilistic perspective on Justyn Ross, the human in me wants to be oh, I love this guy. It would be a fantastic success story. His ceiling was incredible when he was a freshman. And I acknowledge all of that, but the probabilistic part of me, which is the part I've tried to cultivate over the past decade, that is just doesn't matter. He's an undrafted guy. And, at best, we're talking about a guy who is the wide receiver 5 entering the season. And man, he's got to beat out, talk about the RotoViz darlings of years past. He's got to beat out Josh Gordon, Justin Watson, Corey Coleman, Chad Williams. These are all guys that I still love for some reason, And so, no, Justyn Ross, he's not going to be anything. He probably won't be anything. He might make the team, but even if he does, I don't think he's going to turn into anything. That's my cold-hearted. That's my cold-hearted perspective on this.
Breaking hearts and crushing dreams. That's what Matthew Freedman's doing here today.
I don't know. What do you guys think?
My follow-up question would be, he's now in the mid-3rd and going really only a handful of spots after Wan'Dale Robinson, who's the number 43 pick and was a very good player. But there is sort of a tier break after Robinson. Robinson should be going higher, but there's a tier break after him we can understand that. I mean, it's sort of the Tyrion Davis Price range. Another kind of interesting guy there in terms of what the range of outcomes would be. So he's being drafted at the 306, 307 with the probability that he doesn't make the team, right? If you knew he was going to make the team, would he be like a second round pick? Like you mentioned, I mean, the Chiefs have been willing to stash some guys and be patient with some guys. They've had Josh Gordon on the team for a decent amount of time, even though, I mean, he was done a long time ago. They actually put him out there and design plays to get him a touchdown, and it just doesn't work. I mean, there's no reason for Josh Gordon to be around. But they were very patient with DeMarcus Robinson, even though they shouldn't have drafted him where they did, and he was never any good at all. I mean, he doesn't have any strengths as a wide receiver. So you can kind of see this scenario in which they actually would be patient with him. But as you mentioned, I mean, he would have to jump through. I mean, right now, you don't look at it and say any individual guy is blocking him, but MVS, Juju, Sky Moore, McCole Hardman. I mean, even Hardman. I mean, like you said, at best a wide receiver 5, and yet if he's healthy, I mean, he could be better than all 4 of those guys, especially if Juju is done, which unfortunately there's a very strong chance of that. And it's interesting when you actually go through the contracts and you see how both the Juju and the MVS contracts are put together. The Chiefs actually don't believe in those guys.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. There's not one guy who's blocking Justyn Ross. It's more a matter of circumstance. I'd say the biggest part of his circumstance being that he was undrafted, like that has incredibly strong signal. And if he's going in the middle of the 3rd round, like that is unconscionable. Like that probably means he's going, if not ahead of Tyquan Thornton, like kind of maybe in the same vicinity. And I don't have a lot of faith in Tyquan Thornton, but the dude was a 2nd rounder, like that puts him in the vicinity of Calvin Austin, who I think was a really intriguing player. Romeo Doubs with the Packers, who was drafted in the 4th round and broke out earlier in college. Like, oh man, like I could not take him ahead of any of those guys.
And it does put him ahead of those guys. So.
Yeah.